The stale scent of cheap perfume and desperation clung to the velvet curtains of the private room. It was the same perfume my stepmother Margot wore, a cloying floral scent that always promised a new low was just around the corner. This time, the new low was a man named Mr. Silas Thorne, a loan shark whose smile was as thin and sharp as a razor wire. His office, if you could call it that, was tucked away in the back of a smoky, high-stakes poker lounge, a place where fortunes were lost on the turn of a single card. Tonight, I was the fortune being lost. My father, Richard, wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the worn pattern on the oriental rug, his shoulders slumped in a familiar posture of defeated acceptance. Margot, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with a cruel sort of glee. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on the arm of my stepsister, Chloe, who was preening like a cat that had just cornered a particularly plump mouse. They were a matched set of vultures circling what they believed to be a carcass. "The terms are simple, Richard," Mr. Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to make the crystal glasses on his desk tremble. "I forgive your substantial gambling debts. In return, the girl works for me. She pays off what you owe. An elegant solution, don't you think?" "What kind of work?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Inside, my heart was a trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Mr. Thorne's gaze slid over to me, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see me. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, but they missed nothing. "Whatever I require, little bird. Don't worry, I value my assets. You'll be useful." Margot scoffed, a little puff of derision. "Useful? Don't get your hopes up, Mr. Thorne. She's clumsy, lazy, and not particularly bright. The only thing she's ever been good for is costing us money." Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Don't be mean, Mother. Alara tries her best. It's just that her best is, well, this." She gestured vaguely at my simple dress, the one I'd mended 3 times. It was a stark contrast to her own designer outfit, purchased, no doubt, with the money that should have been for my university tuition. My father finally looked up, his face a mask of weary resignation. "It's for the family, Alara. We have no choice." For the family. The words were acid on my tongue. The family that was selling me to a monster to cover debts my father racked up, trying to fund Margot and Chloe's lavish lifestyle. The family that saw me as nothing more than a bargaining chip. A cold calm washed over me, extinguishing the panic. It was a strange feeling, one I'd only felt a few times in my life. It was the hum. It started low, a faint vibration at the base of my skull, a subtle shimmer at the edge of my vision. It was my secret, the one thing they had never been able to mock or steal from me. My unfair advantage, as I'd come to call it in the privacy of my own mind. It was a strange, innate sense, an intuition so powerful it was practically a superpower. It let me see the hidden value in things, the potential that no one else could. Right now, the hum wasn't coming from me, or from the antique desk, or the diamond pinky ring on Thorne's hand. It was coming from him, Mr. Silas Thorne. Not him precisely, but the empire he had built. It was a discordant, chaotic hum, full of risk and rot. But underneath it all, there was a deep, resonant thrum of untapped potential, of immense, explosive value. He was a dangerous man, but he was also an opportunity. Mr. Thorne pushed a stack of papers across the polished mahogany. "Sign here, Richard. Transfer of guardianship. It's all perfectly legal." As my father reached for the pen, his hand trembling, my eyes locked with Mr. Thorne's again. I let a flicker of something, not fear but calculation, show in my expression. I straightened my back. "The debt," I said, my voice clear and cutting through the tension. "What's the exact number?" Thorne raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his cold eyes. $500,000. A steep price for a little bird." "I'll pay it back," I said, "with interest." I held his gaze, letting him see the iron resolve that had been forged in the crucible of my family's cruelty. "And when I'm done, I'll be coming back for them." Margot let out a theatrical gasp and Chloe giggled. My father just sighed, scrawling his signature on the page that signed my life away. But Mr. Thorne didn't laugh. He just watched me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He saw something in me that my family had deliberately ignored their entire lives. He saw an asset, and the hum in my head grew stronger, clearer. He was my captor, my jailer. But he was also going to be my key, the key to my revenge. The door clicked shut behind my family, leaving me alone in the room with the devil who had just bought me. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sliver of something that felt dangerously like hope. My life before that night in Mr. Thorne's office was a long, gray smear of neglect and quiet suffering. It began, I suppose, the day my mother died. I was 6 years old, and my only clear memory of her was the warm, golden light that seemed to follow her everywhere. She was the one who first noticed my gift. I'd find things. A rare coin in a sandbox, an old first edition book in a dusty attic box, a forgotten piece of jewelry that turned out to be worth a small fortune. She'd call it my treasure sense, and would clap with delight, her laughter like wind chimes. After she was gone, the golden light went with her, replaced by the sterile shadow of Margot. Richard, my father, married her less than a year later. Margot arrived with her own daughter, Chloe, who was 2 years my senior and already an expert in the subtle arts of cruelty. From the moment they moved into our home, my mother's home, I was relegated to the status of an unwanted guest. My room was given to Chloe, and I was moved into the small, cold room in the attic. My mother's things were boxed up and stored away, Margot claiming they were too painful a reminder for my father, when in reality she simply wanted to erase any trace of the woman she had replaced. The abuse was never overt enough to leave visible bruises. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a campaign of emotional and financial strangulation. When my mother's inheritance was released on my 18th birthday, a modest sum she had carefully invested for my education, Margot and my father convinced me to put it into a family account for safekeeping. Within 6 months, it was gone, drained to fund Chloe's European shopping spree and a new car for Margot. When I confronted them, my father wouldn't look at me, while Margot explained with chilling calm that it was for the good of the family. "Chloe has so much potential, darling," she'd said, patting my hand with her cold fingers. "She needs these little boosts. You understand, don't you? It's your contribution." My treasure sense became a source of ridicule. If I pointed out an old piece of furniture at a flea market that I felt had value, Margot would dismiss it as junk. Later, I'd read in the paper that the very same piece had sold at auction for thousands. If I had a good feeling about a particular stock in a high school economics class project, my teacher would praise my insight, but Chloe would mock me at the dinner table, calling me lucky loony Ilara. Anything of value I did find, she would promptly claim as her own, and my father would always back her up. "Don't be selfish, Ilara. Share with your sister." They actively sabotaged me. The university application I spent months perfecting mysteriously vanished from my father's desk the day before it was due. The scholarship interview I had was derailed when Chloe accidentally spilled a bottle of red wine on my only good blouse minutes before I had to leave. Each time, they would offer flimsy apologies while their eyes danced with triumph. They needed me to be small. My success would have been a judgment on their own mediocrity, and they couldn't have that. I was their scapegoat, the built-in excuse for all their failures. It was always my fault. The bills were high because I was a financial drain. The mood in the house was tense because I was sullen and ungrateful. My gift, the hum, was the only thing that kept me sane. It was my secret world. I learned to nurture it in silence. I would spend hours in the library, not just reading, but touching the spines of old books, feeling for the faint thrum of a forgotten first edition. I'd walk through antique shops, my hands ghosting over objects, sensing their history and their hidden worth. It was a language only I could understand. I learned that the hum wasn't just about monetary value, it was about potential. A struggling company's stock might have a brighter hum than a blue-chip giant because it was poised for a breakthrough. An overlooked plot of land on the edge of town might resonate with a powerful thrum that spoke of future development. It was a complex, nuanced sense that I was slowly, secretly learning to decipher. This quiet training was my rebellion. While they thought I was wasting my time, I was honing my weapon. I didn't know what I was preparing for, only that a day of reckoning felt inevitable. I kept a small, hidden notebook where I tracked my predictions. Stocks that I felt would soar, art pieces I believed were undervalued, companies I sensed were on the brink of collapse. Looking back, the notebook was a multi-million-dollar portfolio of ghost profits, a testament to what I could have achieved if I'd had any resources of my own. The gambling debts were the final nail in the coffin. My father, a weak man, desperate for the approval of his new wife, had always tried to give Margot and Chloe the world. When his own salary wasn't enough, he started gambling. Small at first, then spiraling into a desperate, all-consuming addiction. He was chasing his losses, convinced the next big win was just around the corner. Margot, far from discouraging it, seemed to revel in the drama and the high-stakes lifestyle it pretended to offer. They bled him dry, and when there was nothing left, they looked at me. I was the last asset they had left to liquidate. So when they sat me down and told me they were in trouble, that Mr. Thorne was their only option, I wasn't surprised. I was just tired. Tired of being the shock absorber for their terrible decisions. The moment they told me their solution, that I would be the payment, the weariness burned away, replaced by that icy calm. I knew this was it. This was the moment my life would either end or finally begin. As I walked into that smoky back room, I didn't feel like a lamb to the slaughter. I felt like a spy going behind enemy lines. They thought they were selling a worthless girl. They had no idea they were handing their greatest enemy the key to a kingdom. They were giving me to a man who, unlike them, knew how to recognize and exploit true value. And I was determined to become the most valuable asset he had ever owned. Life with Silas Thorne was a brutal education. The first week, I was a ghost in his opulent, sterile penthouse that overlooked the city like a predator's perch. I was assigned to a small, windowless room that had once been a storage closet. My job was simple: to be invisible. I cleaned, I cooked, I served drinks to the dangerous men and women who flowed through his apartment at all hours, their conversations a low murmur of conspiracy and illicit deals. Thorne barely spoke to me, his gray eyes sweeping over me as if I were a piece of furniture. He was testing me, I realized, watching to see if I would break, if I would cry, if I would beg. I did none of those things. I watched and I listened and I learned. I cataloged every conversation I overheard. I memorized the names of shell corporations, the whispers of hostile takeovers, the details of back alley deals. At night, in my tiny room, I would write it all down, cross-referencing names and figures, building a mental map of Thorne's shadowy empire. During the day, I used my gift. When a new piece of art arrived to be used as collateral, I would run my fingers over the frame as I dusted, feeling for the hum of authenticity and future appreciation. When Thorne's financial analyst brought him portfolios, I would stand silently refilling his coffee, letting my senses drift over the pages, feeling the faint, sick dissonance of a failing company or the vibrant, rising thrum of an undervalued tech startup. The turning point came a month into my servitude. Thorne was in a rage. A deal had gone sour. He'd invested heavily in a biotech firm based on a tip, and the company had just been exposed as a fraud, its stock plummeting to zero. He had lost millions. He swept a crystal vase off a pedestal, and it shattered against the marble floor. His associates stood frozen, terrified of his fury. I knelt, carefully picking up the larger shards of glass. My hands were steady. "It was the wrong company," I said, my voice quiet but clear. The room fell silent. Thorne turned, his eyes narrowing to slits. "What did you say?" I stood up, holding the broken pieces in my hands. "The company you invested in, Biogenics. It never felt right. There was another one, a smaller lab, Therapeutics. They are the ones who will actually succeed. Their cellular regeneration research is real. Their value is going to explode within the next 6 months." I had read a brief about them in a discarded financial paper weeks ago, and the name had hummed at me with such intensity that I had committed it to memory. One of his advisors scoffed. "And how would you know that? Did you get a hot tip while you were scrubbing the floors?" I ignored him, my eyes fixed on Thorne. "It's not a tip, it's a feeling. The same way a geologist feels for oil, I feel for value. Biogenics always felt hollow. Therapeutics feels like gold." Thorne stared at me for a long, silent minute. The air crackled with tension. I had taken an immense risk. He could have me thrown out, or worse. But I had also seen the chaos in his own operations. He was powerful, yes, but his power was built on brute force and intimidation. He lacked finesse. He lacked the one thing I had in spades: true foresight. He pointed a finger at his head of acquisitions, a slick man named Marcus. You, get me everything on Serotherapeutics, now. Then he looked back at me. You have one chance, little bird. If you're right, we talk. If you're wrong, he smiled that razor wire smile, I'll find a much less comfortable use for you. That was the moment I stopped being a victim. It was the moment I decided to lean into the storm. I wouldn't just survive, I would conquer. My plan began to form, not as a vague dream of revenge, but as a cold, hard strategy. Phase 1 was to make myself indispensable to Thorne. I would become his secret weapon, his oracle of profit. I would use my gift to make him so much money that my $500,000 debt would become a laughable pittance. I would transform myself from his property into his partner. Phase 2 was to build my own foundation. I would negotiate my terms. Not just the erasure of my debt, but a percentage, a cut of the profits I generated. I would build my own fortune under the umbrella of his fearsome reputation. He would be the hammer, but I would be the hand that guided it. I would learn everything I could from him: how to structure a deal, how to leverage power, how to be ruthless. Phase 3, the final phase, was the one that fueled me through the long nights and the terrifying days. I would turn my gaze back to the family that had discarded me. I knew their weaknesses because I had lived with them my entire life. Their greed, their vanity, their utter lack of foresight. Without me as their financial and emotional scapegoat, they would crumble. I knew it. They would make bad investments, live beyond their means, and fall into debt. It was only a matter of time. And when they were at their most desperate, when they owed money to someone just like Thorne, I would be waiting. I wouldn't just ruin them. I would buy them. I would own their debt, their home, their future. The same fate they had so casually condemned me to would become their permanent reality, with one crucial difference: I would be the one holding the leash. The girl they sold would become their master. The thought was so exquisitely perfect, so poetically just, that it didn't just give me hope. It gave me a purpose sharp and hard as a diamond. The next 6 months were a blur of frantic work and high-stakes gambles. True to my prediction, Serotherapeutics announced a breakthrough, and their stock value didn't just rise, it went supernova. Thorne's initial cautious investment, made at my urging, multiplied 100-fold. The day the news broke, he called me into his office. The shattered vase had been replaced by a hideous modernist sculpture that gave off a dull, leaden hum of bad taste. "The debt is paid," he said without preamble. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. It was the first time I had been invited to sit. "Now, we talk terms." That was the beginning of my ascent. I was no longer Ilara, the maid. I became Thorne's oracle, his pet analyst. I was his secret weapon, kept hidden away in the penthouse, my existence known only to his most trusted inner circle. They hated me. Marcus, his head of acquisitions, saw me as a charlatan who had gotten lucky. The others saw me as a rival for Thorne's ear. They resented the way he would pause a meeting, turn to me where I stood silently by the window, and ask, "Well, Ilara, what does it feel like?" And I would tell him. I'd tell him that the proposed merger with a shipping conglomerate felt brittle, like a dead branch, or that a piece of forgotten downtown real estate felt thirsty, humming with the promise of a coming gentrification boom. I couldn't explain the mechanics of it, the how or the why. It was a primal sense, and Thorne, a man who trusted his own ruthless instincts above all else, learned to trust mine. He gave me a small office, a computer, and unlimited access to financial data. I worked 18-hour days, my eyes raw from staring at screens, but I had never felt more alive. I guided him through a minefield of investments, helping him sidestep disastrous deals and pouring his capital into ventures that blossomed with shocking speed and profitability. I identified an obscure artist whose paintings hummed with genius. A year later, her work was selling for millions. I flagged a tech company whose code felt elegant and strong. They were bought out by a tech giant 6 months later, making Thorne's initial investment look like a masterstroke of genius. For every million I made him, I demanded my percentage. At first, it was small, just 1%. But as my successes piled up, my demands grew 5%, 10%. Thorne grumbled and threatened, but he always paid. He was making more money than he ever had in his life, and he knew I was the reason. I was his golden goose, and he wasn't about to kill me. He just had to make sure I never left the cage. I didn't mind the cage, not yet. I was learning. I was growing stronger, my gift sharpening with constant use. I started to understand its nuances. I could not only sense value, but also the nature of that value. Some things hummed with a quick, fiery energy, a short-term gain. Others had a deep, slow, resonant thrum, a long-term legacy. I learned to read the discordant, sour notes of fraud and the flat, dead silence of failure. All the while, I kept a watch on my family. It was easy enough. I had one of Thorne's tech experts put a discreet trace on their finances. It was exactly as I had predicted. Without me to absorb their financial recklessness, their world began to unravel. My father, chasing the high of his one-time solution with Thorne, started gambling even more heavily, but his luck was abysmal. Margot and Chloe, accustomed to a lifestyle they could no longer afford, continued to spend with abandon. They bought designer clothes, took lavish trips, and hosted extravagant parties, all on credit. They were putting on a performance, desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth and status. The first sign of their real trouble came 8 months after they sold me. My father's business, a small consulting firm he'd inherited, declared bankruptcy. I watched its stock ticker flatline with a cold, detached satisfaction. There was no hum there. It had been a hollow shell for years, propped up by loans and lies. Next, they took out a second mortgage on the house, my mother's house. I felt a pang of anger so sharp it took my breath away. They were tainting her memory with their filth and desperation. The debts piled up. Credit cards were maxed out. Loans were taken from increasingly shady lenders. They sold my mother's jewelry, the last pieces of her Margot hadn't already pawned off. They were in a death spiral, and they were too proud and too foolish to see it. The final piece of my plan clicked into place a year and a half after I became Thorne's oracle. Marcus burst into my office one morning, his face pale with fury. "He's done it," he seethed. "The old man is buying out the Blackwater portfolio. It's a disaster. The whole thing is toxic debt, subprime loans, it's financial poison." I pulled up the portfolio on my screen. Marcus was right. On the surface, it was a nightmare, a collection of high-risk, near-default personal and commercial loans. It was the kind of mess no sane investor would touch. But as my eyes scanned the list of names, my breath caught in my throat. My senses began to hum. It wasn't the hum of profit. It was something else, something sharp and personal. It was the hum of victory. There, buried deep in the toxic sludge of the Blackwater portfolio, were 3 names: Richard, Margot, and Chloe. Their credit card debts, their car loans, their second mortgage. It was all there. Another lender had bundled up their failures and sold them off. And Silas Thorne, on the advice of some other, less gifted analyst, was about to buy the whole package. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. My family had sold me to a loan shark for $500,000, and I was about to buy their entire pathetic existence for pennies on the dollar. The poetry of it was breathtaking. I let Thorne complete the purchase. I didn't say a word. Marcus was furious with me, accusing me of letting the boss walk into a trap. I simply told him to trust me. The day the deal was finalized, I walked into Thorne's office. I had my own portfolio now, a sleek, leather-bound binder detailing the fortune I had built for myself from my percentage. "I want to cash out," I said, placing the binder on his desk. "And I want to buy a piece of your new portfolio, a specific piece of debt." Thorne eyed me suspiciously. "Tired of making money, little bird?" "I'm moving on to a more personal project," I said. "I want the debt belonging to Richard, Margot, and Chloe. I'll pay you the full face value, plus a 20% premium." He pulled up the file, his eyes scanning the numbers. Their total debt was staggering, nearly $1 million. Paying a premium was insane. but he saw the look in my eyes and understood. This wasn't a financial transaction for me, it was a trophy hunt. "You're a cold piece of work, Alara," he said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "I see why we get along." He nodded to his assistant. "Draw up the papers. The debt is hers." The climax wasn't a single moment, but a cascade of carefully orchestrated events, each one designed to strip away another layer of my family's fabricated reality. With the legal ownership of their debt in my hands, I was no longer a ghost from their past. I was the wolf at their door, and I intended to huff and to puff and to blow their whole rotten house down. My first move was to freeze their assets. One by one, their credit cards were declined. Chloe threw a now infamous tantrum at a high-end boutique, a scene that was gleefully recorded by onlookers and quickly went viral. The video was pathetic. My beautiful, pampered stepsister screeching like a banshee because she couldn't buy a purse she didn't need with money she didn't have. Watching it on my laptop from the comfort of my own spacious apartment, a place larger than their entire house, I felt the first true sweet taste of victory. Next came the cars. A sleek black tow truck arrived at their manicured suburban home and repossessed Margot's luxury sedan and Chloe's little red sports car in the middle of the day, right when all the neighbors were home from work. I had arranged it specifically for maximum humiliation. Margot, I was told by the repossession agent, had tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, her voice dripping with the false authority she no longer possessed. Then I went after the house, my mother's house. This was the most personal part of my revenge, the reclamation of my own history. I didn't just want to evict them, I wanted them to know with absolute certainty who was casting them out into the cold. I sent the foreclosure notice not through a faceless law firm, but via a personal courier with a note attached. It contained only 3 words: "Rent is due." Their desperation was palpable. My father called me for the first time in nearly 2 years. His voice, once dismissive and patronizing, was now thin and pleading. "Alara, it's your father," he started, as if I could have forgotten. "There's been some kind of terrible mistake. Some company, EV Holdings, has bought our mortgage. They're trying to take the house." "There's no mistake, Richard," I said, savoring the way his name felt on my tongue, stripped of the title father. "EV stands for Alara's Victory. It's my company." There was a long, strangled silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Margot shrieking in the background, the sound muffled and frantic. "You?" he finally whispered, his voice full of disbelief and dawning horror. "How? That loan shark. We thought—" "You thought I'd be broken, used up, and discarded." I finished for him, my voice as cold and hard as glacial ice. "You thought wrong. You sold me, Richard. You set a price on my head. I simply paid it. And then I started investing. It turns out I have a talent for it. You sold your most valuable asset to pay for your most worthless liabilities." I could hear Chloe start to wail now, her cries joining her mother's. The symphony of their despair was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. "Please, Alara," he begged, the pathetic man-child finally emerging from behind the facade of paternal authority. "We're your family. You can't do this to us." "You stopped being my family the day you handed me over to Silas Thorne to save your own skins," I retorted. "You are a bad investment, Richard, a toxic asset, and I am simply liquidating." I gave them 1 week to vacate the premises. The day of the eviction was a perfect, crisp autumn afternoon. I arrived not in a tow truck or with a sheriff, but in a chauffeured black town car. I wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than their entire remaining wardrobe. I stepped onto the lawn, the same lawn where my mother had taught me how to do cartwheels, and watched as the movers I had hired carried their gaudy, tasteless furniture out to the curb. They stood there in a pathetic little cluster on the sidewalk. Richard, his face gray and slack-jawed. Margot, her makeup streaked with tears of rage, her cheap perfume doing nothing to mask the sour smell of defeat, and Chloe, wrapped in a blanket, looking pale and lost without her designer armor. I walked right up to them. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I spoke in a calm, quiet voice that forced them to lean in and listen. "This is not a negotiation," I began, my gaze sweeping over the 3 of them. "This is a statement of account. You owe me $974,000 plus interest. This house will cover a fraction of that. For the rest, you will work. Margot lunged at me, her fingers crooked into claws. You little witch! You will not get away with this. My chauffeur, a large, impassive man named Arthur, stepped smoothly between us. I didn't even flinch. Get away with what, Margot? I asked. Getting back what you stole from me? My inheritance, my education, my childhood? This isn't even a fraction of what you owe. I own you. Every dollar you earn, a portion of it will come to me. Every place you live will be because I allow it. You sold me into servitude, so I'm returning the favor. Welcome to your new life. I turned to Chloe, whose eyes were wide with a terror that was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Remember how you told me my best was working as a maid? Well, I have a friend who owns a hotel cleaning service. They're always looking for new hires. I've taken the liberty of arranging an interview for you. And Margot, there's a diner downtown that needs a dishwasher. The shifts are long and the pay is terrible. You start Monday. To Richard, I simply said, you'll find work where you can. A man with your skills is always in demand for manual labor, I'm sure. I let the words hang in the air, let the full weight of their new reality crash down upon them. They had built their world on my suffering, and I had just dismantled it brick by brick, using their own greed as the wrecking ball. The public shaming was complete. The neighbors were all peering through their windows, watching the mighty fall. The family that had always looked down on everyone was now, quite literally, on the street. I walked through the front door of my mother's house, the air inside already feeling lighter, cleaner, as if the very walls were sighing in relief. The movers were gone. It was empty, a blank canvas. My canvas. I walked through the rooms, running my hand along the walls, feeling the faint, warm hum of home, a feeling I hadn't known since I was 6 years old. The nightmare was over. Theirs was just beginning. In the year that followed, my life transformed into something I could never have dared to dream of. The first thing I did was reclaim my mother's house. I hired architects and designers not to erase the past, but to honor it. We tore out Margot's cold, ostentatious decor and restored the house to the warm, light-filled sanctuary I vaguely remembered from childhood. I filled it with art that hummed with life and furniture that felt like a welcoming embrace. In the garden, I planted the same kind of roses my mother used to love, and their scent drifting through the open windows was a daily balm to my soul. My company, EV Holdings, flourished. Freed from the singular focus of my revenge, I turned my gift toward more constructive ends. I invested in sustainable technologies, visionary startups, and philanthropic ventures that supported education for underprivileged girls, the kind of chance I had been denied. My wealth grew, but it was a quiet, solid wealth, not the flashy, hollow kind my family had chased. It was built on creating value, not just accumulating it. I found that the strongest, most resonant hum came not from things that made the most money, but from those that made the most difference. I severed all ties with Silas Thorne. The day I walked out of his penthouse for the last time, I felt no fear. He had been a necessary evil, a tool I had used to carve out my new life. He'd tried to persuade me to stay, offering me a full partnership, but I refused. His world was one of shadows and threats, a world that hummed with a constant, low-grade violence. I was finished with that. As I left, he simply nodded, a grudging respect in his cold, gray eyes. "Fly high, little bird," he'd said. And I did. My old family, however, remained tethered to the ground, weighed down by the debt they owed me. I had a law firm manage the account, garnishing their wages with cold, mechanical efficiency. True to my word, Margot and Chloe went to work at the menial jobs I'd arranged for them. Chloe lasted 2 weeks at the hotel before being fired for her attitude. She drifted from one low-wage job to another, her beauty fading, her spirit curdled with a bitterness that made her unemployable. The last I heard, she was a cashier at a discount grocery store, her once manicured nails chipped, her designer clothes replaced by a cheap polyester uniform. Margot, surprisingly, kept her job as a dishwasher. The grueling, thankless work seemed to have scoured away her vanity, leaving behind a raw, exhausted core. I would occasionally receive reports from the restaurant manager. He said she never spoke, just worked with a grim, relentless determination, her hands raw and chapped. Perhaps in the steam and the grime, she was finally washing away a lifetime of sins. And Richard, my father, simply disappeared. He couldn't handle the humiliation. He couldn't handle being a failure in the eyes of the world, and more importantly, in the eyes of the daughter he had so casually betrayed. He left a note for Margot one night, packed a bag, and vanished. I never tried to find him. He was a ghost to me long before he was gone. The ultimate catharsis came not from watching their downfall, but from realizing how little I thought of them at all. They were a chapter of my life that was now closed, a bad debt that had been settled. My victory wasn't just in their ruin, but in my own peace. One evening, I was sitting on the back porch of my home, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and rose. The air was soft. The scent of the roses was sweet, and for the first time, the world around me was completely, blessedly quiet. The constant, anxious hum of threats and opportunities had softened to a gentle, steady thrum of contentment. I had paid my debt. I had come back and bought theirs. I had taken everything they had stolen from me and more. But as I sat there, I realized the greatest prize wasn't the house, the money, or the power. It was this quiet moment of peace, the freedom to be the architect of my own life, to build something beautiful on the ashes of the past. They had tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. And in the silence of my victory, I was finally free to grow.